Weaver, and tonight's my great pleasure to introduce Jorge Otero-Pailos to the AA. Jorge is an architect and a theorist and associate professor of historic preservation at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture. He's also the founder of Future Anterior, a journal of history, theory, and criticism in preservation studies. And he's soon to be publishing his first book, now called The Search for Experience, Architectural Phenomenology, History, and Theory. Underlying all of Jorge's research is the paradox that architectural conservation actually destroys as much as it preserves, and that instead we should celebrate the pollutants that have attached themselves to architecture over the years. In A Files, in the last issue of A Files, we published a body of research of those pollutants, of his olfactory reconstruction of Philip Johnson's Glass House, which BD magazine described as the first ever critical scratch and sniff essay. And more recently still, at last year's Manifesta, Jorge abandoned smell and looked instead at dust, creating a piece called The Ethics of Dust, which analyzed the accretions of dust and other pollutants on a wall inside the disused Alumix building in Bolzano, northern Italy. And at the moment, Jorge is recreating that piece at the Doge's Palace in Venice for the Art Biennale for this year. So as much as how pieces like this inform and subvert our ideas of architectural history, by working and teaching as an academic, Jorge has also transformed the usually rather sleepy discipline of architectural conservation into something really quite avant-garde. So much so that at Columbia, if you really want to study cutting-edge architectural thinking, you don't, it seems to me, sign up to studios by Greg Lynn, Hernan Diaz Alonso, or Carl Chu. Instead, you enroll in the Historic Preservation Program. Jorge Otero-Pailos.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Tom, for that very kind introduction. And I just want to start by thanking Brett Steele for the invitation, and also Tom for the invitation, and also for working on that AA Files article, which was really difficult to produce. We found out how hard it is to make a scratch and sniff article, and also the smell of ink really matters in the end. I also want to thank Adam Phillips and Mark Cousins for coming to the lecture. It means a lot to me that you're here. And also everybody that is here tonight, thank you very much for attending. I just want to present a little bit of my recent work. They're really all part of a search for an alternative mode of creativity in architectural practice, one that is not based on originality or intentionality. And I use the rubric of experimental preservation to describe my work. So let me start with an example. The one that Tom just discussed, which is the olfactory reconstruction of Philip Johnson's Glass House. My reconstruction went between 1949 and 1969, 49 being the date in which the building was actually built. And I went to 69 for reasons that I'll mention in a minute. It was a collaboration, as most works of preservation always are. There's many authors to this. Some of the other principal authors are Rosendo Mateu. He's a perfumer of Puig fragrances out of Barcelona. They make things like Prada perfumes and all this stuff. But they have a great archive of every single scent that has been manufactured in the 20th century. It's essentially like 20,000 smells. And every time that they create a smell, they go through these locating keywords, and then they kind of mix them together to achieve something that will be appealing. But sometimes they do these they collaborate with different artists to produce specialty kind of fragrances. And in this case, the reconstruction was composed of 3 distinct aromas that were meant to be smelled in sequence. And they were meant to provide a kind of compressed experience of the first 2 decades of the house. So the first smell reconstructs the smell of the new house when it was built in 1949, and it's a mix of newly lacquered woods, newly painted steel, fresh plaster from the ceiling, cement mortar on the floor, a hint of leather from the New Barcelona chairs, and also in the bathroom ceiling. It is made up of terpinolene, beta-pinene, and trementine combined with oleates, and also conveys a sensation of humidity and kind of mold and wet earth. The second aroma reconstructs the olfaction preferred by sophisticated American men of the 1950s. And the reason why I thought that that was important was because Philip Johnson was in the habit of inviting people to his house for various talks. And these were the most important people of the New York kind of power architectural elite. Here you have Vincent Scully visiting the house. Much later, there is Peter Eisenman on the left visiting the house, and Johnson is over here, a little bit older. And here is Andy Warhol in the house. This was a particularly important photograph for me, and this is the one we used for the AA Files article. And that will lead to the third smell. But here we decided to use, basically, it turns out that there were not that many fragrances that men used to use in the 1950s. There were basically Old Spice, Canoe, English Lavender, Aqua Velva, and a few others. So we basically did a kind of combination of these fragrances to give the smell of men. Johnson was gay. He was a big, sophisticated member of the elite in New York. He was, I think you will all know this, I mean, he was the director of the MoMA Architecture Department, put together the big 1932 exhibition on modern architecture and so on. He was kind of the power broker of New York architecture. The third aroma reconstructs the smell of the house in the 1960s, by which point all the porous surfaces of the house had become impregnated with the smell of thousands of cigarettes and cigars that were smoked inside the house. And in fact, they had stained parts of the house. And what we used for that was a mix of absolutes of dry leaves of tobacco, pure cigar effect, black tobacco, tobacco from Bulgaria, scent of smoke, incense. We used burnt logs to signify the fireplace. You can see the stains of on the ceiling of all the smoke. There's also some water stains. We use some scents of burnt logs because they've also created a particular scent in the house, and also here in the ceiling of the bathroom, the leather over time has been absorbing moisture and has a bunch of mold in it, and now has to be replaced. So we tried to really recreate all of that. I put this picture up because in these meetings, that was the result of the meeting with Warhol, basically a commission for Warhol to paint Philip Johnson. So these meetings were not just kind of happenstance, get around the table and, shoot the breeze. It was very real kind of power brokering going on. In fact, Philip Johnson donated a lot of the major Warhols to the MoMA, like the Marilyn Monroe and others. And so here you have them, by the way. So this is David Whitney, Johnson's partner, Warhol. I don't know who that person is. And that's Robert Stern, sitting around the table talking about art and architecture. Now, the reason why I got involved in this project was because I visited the Glass House in 2007 at the invitation of Marty Skrelinas, who's the resident conservator. Philip Johnson decided to donate the house to the National Trust for Historic Preservation and basically gave them all the money to maintain it. So he was very much involved in his own glorification. And so he brought me in to basically discuss the ceiling of the house because they were thinking about cleaning it. It was stained with all the cigarettes. And for me, it was very troubling that they were going to actually clean The ceiling had never been repainted, basically 50-odd years of them living in there, and they'd never been touched. And I was actually really surprised by how yellow it was. It's got kind of nasty, the ceiling was. And it also struck me all of a sudden that the house has no operable windows. You can't really ventilate this house unless you open the doors. And in fact, at one point, they left the doors open all the time, and a deer went in, and it couldn't get out, so it broke all the windows. It just, smashed against all the windows in the house. So that to me really led me to start doing some research into the house. And even though the house had been in the public eye since it was built, I realized that not much had really been written at all about the house's smells. It's been a house that has launched a number of critiques about visuality, the nature of narcissism, even reflections on lighting schemes and so on, and how do you light this thing so that there's no reflections in and out, and the collaborations with Richard Kelly, the lighting designer, but nothing about the smell of the house, which to me also, when I went into the house, it was a kind of very kind of old people's home type of smell in there. And they were actively trying to deodorize the house, and to me that was troubling in some fundamental way. So I began to do a little bit of research, and we all know the house. It's a 56 by 32 perimeter with the 8 columns. Here's the bed, the closet. This is the kind of living room, quote unquote, the dining area, a kitchen, bathroom, and this is the fireplace and a little seat for a little study. And then there's these four doors that open up into the garden, and the 18-foot wide inoperable glass plate glass windows, which of course Johnson, by the way, made sure that, how glass has always the logo of the manufacturer on the bottom corner? He made sure to cut it out. He didn't want any of the logo. Now the house's reconstruction is being sponsored by Old Castle Glass, which is replacing all the glass with their logo on it, which to me is unacceptable. But anyway, so there's all this kind of, little details going on in the reconstruction of the house. We all know the H detail on the corner and how it hits the ground. For me, what was problematic about the lack of documentation in the house's smells and odors is that preservation has a tendency to turn the buildings it touches into the documents about the buildings. So for example, people will use photographs, historic photographs, to go back to a particular state and time. And so we end up really doing a sort of violence to the building itself and turning it into its own kind of representation, which is somehow very strange. And I was worried that because there is nothing written about the smell of the house, this would, in a sense, authorize the deodorization of the house. So I began to just kind of look at this and try to prevent the distortion of the house through the filter of available scholarship, because the scholarship had this kind of lacuna. So if we look at the house through that scholarship, then it'll appear to be an odorless house. And of course, glass is odorless. It's an odorless material. It's one of the few. But it's really, if you look at the surface areas of the house, most of it is not glass. So you have that sense that it could be an odorless house, but in fact, it really isn't. And I felt it was really an important moment to really address this, because it's the moment that the house is becoming a public museum. So it's turning from a private house to a public museum, and for me, it was important to try to think about what could we do to really begin to intervene in the preservation project and to begin to destabilize the preservation project that the National Trust was doing. So what I did was I proposed to perfume the house with these 3 smells, so that when people would come into the house and visit the house, they would get the environment would smell either as 1949, 1959, 1969. And initially, the National Trust was very happy. They were really into it. They said, oh, that's great. And they were saying, we're going to bottle it up, and we're going to sell it at the visitor shop, and it'll be great, and da-da-da-da. And I submitted the smells to them, and they didn't smell quite like perfume. They didn't smell good, essentially. They smelled like a stale house. So we began to run into some problems. I nevertheless continued to look at the materials, and so here you have some of the peeling leather tiles. So trying to look at the house itself as opposed to the documents about the house. There were some documents, like for example the bidding document here, where you can have a kind of roster of all the materials that were there and how much they cost. But I kind of looked at the writings about the house also, but looked at it for clues about smells, about what were the kinds of things that he might have been thinking. Was Philip Johnson really interested in smell at all or not? And it turns out that one of the things that he cited, one of the architects that he cited as being influential in determining the shape of the house, making it a pavilion home, basically like, he called it an absolute shape, was Ledoux. And he called him the father of modern architecture, very influenced by the writings of Kaufman, and so on. And, Johnson's invocation of Ledoux, for me, may offer an important clue regarding his olfactory aesthetics, because for Ledoux, the ability of individuals to be housed in separate, well-ventilated rooms was both a physical and a moral therapeutic imperative. Ledoux was obsessed with the purity of air in buildings, and their autonomy was dictated in part by ventilation needs. And in various projects that he did, like the Ideal Town of Chaux, he separated houses and public buildings into pavilions so that you could isolate people and air them separately. Alain Corbin is really the person that has looked at this most closely and has shown how Ledoux's development of the pavilion form is really part of a larger European cultural moment in which specialists in every field really began to fight foul smells in order to stem the spread of disease. And it's really interesting that in the 18th century and much of the 19th century, before Pasteur's proof that disease was not transmitted by foul air but actually by microorganisms, social reformers identified bad smells as signs and bearers of morbidity. And so in the late 18th century, scientists like Jean Godefroy Leonardi and Antoine Lavoisier and others collected, decanted, and confined preserved airs, they also called them gases, and located the effects of each of them on animal organisms. And so they established these taxonomies of what they called respirable airs that eventually led to the discovery of air as not being an element, but actually a mixture of gases. Actually, these early inventories of airs are the precursors of the smell archives, like the ones that we used to create the smells. But the point being that other people's sweat, other people's smell, were thought to be sources of contagion. And in the 1940s in the United States, you have to remember that it was still, tuberculosis was still kind of a scary thing. You could be, transmission of tuberculosis, you could get it from other people. And the thought was you could get it from breath and so on, and spit. So I began to think of the relationship between his glass house, which is right here, and everybody always photographs just the glass house, and the brick house, which is just across. And it's really, he always thought of it as two pavilions that make up a house. So what he was really dividing is these two things. And the idea is that he was trying to make a commentary on steel construction and brick construction and on function. This is the Kaufmanian kind of interpretation. But the uses inside the house, so and the claim is that he was really separating uses. And when you look at the uses of each house has, or each pavilion has a bed, has a place to read and write, has a bathroom, has a place to hang a picture, has a storage, which is that in the glass component is a kind of closet that sits up against the bed. So really the use, programmatically speaking, is the same, except that the users are different. These are for guests, and the other house is actually for him. So for me that was very interesting because it's really this distinction between users as opposed to between uses that for me was critical in really beginning to think about the question of smell. He was not just separating functions, he was also kind of moving other people away from him, kind of collecting air for himself around himself. And the idea of isolating people in rooms and placing a window right above the bed goes back again to the design of military barracks and hospital designs of architects like Leroy, who propose an individual outlet on the top of every patient's bed to protect them from the smell of other patients. So in a way, for me, when Johnson is openly kind of hearkening back to these 18th century precedents, for me it's important not to forget that these 18th century precedents come with this whole very important moment in the history of architecture and the sociology of smell. So, this is the view then from Johnson's pavilion to the guest pavilion. The guests are completely out of view. And clearly Johnson's interest in individual isolation had a narcissistic dimension. I mean, he did, after all, choose to seclude himself, in his house alone. He did walk around, naked a lot of the time, and I guess his neighbors did complain a lot. And certainly there is this narcissistic dimension, but by focusing on the aesthetics of olfaction and not just the visual aesthetics, what I tried to do is to enrich previous visual analysis, because we can appreciate more clearly, I think, that the relationship between the choice of dividing the house in two pavilions and Johnson's taste for bourgeois self-fashioning, we can see that relationship without falling into the trap of identifying the architectural type of the pavilion with the social type of the bourgeois, because in my view, after all, the glass pavilion alone is not what reflects a bourgeois sensitivity. Rather, it's the way the two pavilions were used to separate users and control their ability to smell each other and to see each other. So what I was trying to do through the olfactory reconstruction is I was trying to basically install a new architectural experience within the existing building that would frustrate the search for origins and originality as authorizing sources of history. I wanted to subtly destabilize the idea that the house should be returned to what Johnson intended it to be. For me, Johnson's intentions were not necessarily the most important. I wanted to put the National Trust's project in a sort of crisis by confronting it with the reality of the building itself and presenting it with new material evidence that would challenge previous assumptions about the building. So if the house smelled, despite what Johnson wanted or didn't want, whether he wanted an odorless environment or not, we will never really know. And it didn't smell well. So now, of course, what happened is, and Adam was there, we had this conversation. They invited us to the glass house for the conversation. I designed this installation for the house for that conversation, so that we would all smell it as a kind of prototype of what this thing could be. And they got a whiff of what I was doing ahead of the conversation, and they basically said no. I brought the smells anyway, and we all kind of moved around the table and kind of smelled them and so on. But it was banned, and so it turned into an article for AA Files, which was all the better. It was much more interesting, in fact. But what I was trying to do is that, you know, Johnson's intention are not the only thing that should count. And it's not so much the original condition of the building. That's why I tried to do 20 years. I was more interested in the temporality of this installation. For me, buildings are much more and much less than what architects say they are, what they intend. They have a life that goes beyond the architect's intentions. And if they stand for more than a few decades, they're always transformed, changed, manipulated by subsequent generations of builders and architects. Preservation creativity never happens ex nihilo. It's always a response to a human product that is already around. That for me is really, really important. It's also a temporary thing. It's a temporary appropriation of those products. And it's an appropriation that is done for the sake of something. It's for the sake of history, for the sake of memory, for the sake of the public. And I'm interested in preservation as a creative mode of appropriating buildings for the sake of architecture. For me, it's a way of producing new relevant knowledge about architecture. And that's what I mean by the definition of preservation as the practice of installing architecture in buildings. A big influence for me is Gordon Matta Clark, who you see here cutting a building in New Jersey. And for me, this is 1974. What he did here is that he basically took a building that was not considered architecture. This was a vernacular, quote-unquote, suburban house. And he went out. It was meant to be demolished because they were going to build a bigger building on the site. So he went out and he cut it just before it was going to be demolished, and then he removed a little bit of the foundation, and he essentially split the house, and it's called splitting. You can see he removed one course of the foundation over there. And what is interesting for me about this is that before the intervention of Gordon Matta Clark, the house essentially remained close to what we call architecture. And Matta Clark's intervention kind of appropriated this quote-unquote building, installing architecture within it. And how he did that, I think is by using the building to open up relevant questions about architecture. So for instance, it interrogated the definition of architecture according to the principle of structural stability, examined the limits of the possibility of inhabitation. And so through Matta Clark's intervention, the building architecture kind of surged in the building long after it had been erected. So for me, it would be incorrect at the same time to say that Gordon Matta Clark was the author of this architecture somehow. I think that after Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author of 67, or Foucault's What is an Author of 69, Bourdieu's studies on the co-authoring role of the reception agents and so on, we really we have to take into account all the various agents like the builders, the contractors, the clients that went into making this object into which architecture was installed. The work of Gordon Matta Clark, for me, was a revelation in the sense that existing buildings could be made to further architecture, to open up questions about architecture long before they were built, and in the absence of an original architect. Like this building, nobody can trace back who the original architect of this building was. And in a sense, it's not that important. But understood in this way, architectural creativity, I think, takes an interesting twist because it's not only making new buildings, but also the art of transforming how we experience and interpret existing buildings in our particular time. So preservation is a form of appropriation. It follows in this line of appropriation art or appropriation thinking. And it's a form of appropriation that only makes sense for a particular length of time. And that's why I see preservation as a kind of event within the life of a building, an event of appropriation within the life of a building, an architectural event. Now, one of the simplest operations through which preservation appropriates buildings is through cleaning. And here you have Bramante's cloister of Santa Maria della Pace in Rome, in Italy, half cleaned, half dirty. And you can see the arguments that are made about the kind of ability to read the building and how cleaning helps to take away the deformations that soiling might make in your ability to read the precise depth and so on of buildings. So, you know, when considered from the point of view of conservation, cleaning is really not just a matter of maintenance and practical things, but really it's an epistemological pursuit. It's a kind of question about what is this building, what is this thing? And it occupies really a central place, the practice of cleaning, in conservation literature. For example, for Cesare Brandi, Italy's, I guess, most prominent conservation theorist of the post, well, really most of the 30s, 40s, 50s. For him, he theorized cleaning as a moment of discovery, as a kind of learning. The occasions to clear aside dirt were for him opportunities to lay bare and expand types of knowledge in conservation. So, you know, this is really kind of a central part of what conservation does, is to speculate about what can be revealed by taking away. But what's interesting to me is that the dirt itself that's removed from buildings is never really theorized apart from being, recently that is, in the 20th century, apart from being kind of extraneous to the building. And so I began to get really interested in the process of cleaning. And part of what I was interested in is I was very influenced by people like Mierle Laderman-Ukalis, who is a performance artist, and she's distinguished herself for a career devoting, exploring the cultural stigma associated with cleaning. And here, this is her 1973 performance titled Hartford Wash, where she carefully hand-cleaned the front entrance steps of the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut. And so she brought cleaning, she kind of impersonated a cleaning lady, and she brought cleaning out in the open as a kind of, first of all, a gendered thing. Second of all, something that has to happen out of sight. You know, it happens when the museum closes. And so there was also kind of a commentary on the fact that there were not female artists in the museum. So it was a kind of institutional critique, and it was also drawing attention to the fact that there's different types of cleaning, like the conservation cleaning that happens is precise. You get paid a lot of money to do it. You do this kind of cleaning, and you know it's a kind of there's a social hierarchy, and you don't get paid a lot to do it. So for me, this was very interesting to see somebody being able to take on the act of cleaning to reveal other things, not just aesthetic integrity, for instance, which is what preservationists are mostly after, this visual thing. But actually a kind of institutional critique that cleaning could actually be a critical act, for me was really important. And I was very drawn to artist photographs of famous architectural buildings, because I think this is a picture by Jeff Wall. He's another person that, you know, another artist that for me is really influential. Is, you know, he takes this picture of the Barcelona pavilion with an immigrant laborer cleaning it. And all of a sudden, the whole history of modern architecture just gets recast, you know, because modern architecture is so much about all the shiny surfaces, all the reflections, all the shiny marbles and so on, right? But somebody has to clean that stuff so that it is shiny, so that it reads in a particular way, so that it helps us, you know, so that it stays modern, quote unquote. And so for me, it was really interesting to see this all of a sudden in such a kind of clear way, by approaching the question of cleaning, to see the kind of social structure that modernism depended on for itself. That this whole discourse of fabrication and so on and so forth was really depending on a big availability of labor to clean it up and make it look shiny and new. So to me that, he's really a very influential figure, and also he's taken on the question of conservation. This is his photograph called Restoration. It's a picture of a restoration in Lucerne, and for me it's a critique of preservation in the sense that here are the actual conservators. They're applying a gauze on the painting in which they're going to apply some cleaning material and some stabilizing agents. They're wearing tank tops, they're sweaty, they're doing the hand work, right? And then there's a whole kind of structure. Another female conservator, she's supervising. She's kind of looking around to make sure that things are happening. And then there's like these men back here who are really in control. They're probably the head conservators for the job, who are really discussing, how much they're going to get paid for this, and so on and so forth. And they're really worried with the institutional problems of conservation. And it's interesting that although conservation is mostly women, very few women are really head conservators. Venice is one of the very few spots where there is a head conservator is a woman, Renata Godello. And some of the people under her are also women. But it's really very male-dominated, which is very strange. So for me, this work began to also carry out a kind of institutional critique, and I began to think of how would one do that. And so I want to show you this project, which I'm just, it's really not a project yet, because I'm actually doing it as we speak. We're working on it this week, which is in Venice. It's in this building over here in the Doge's Palace, in which I'm basically preserving the pollution on that building, inside that building. And this is Piazza San Marco. This is a famous view of Piazza San Marco. This is the Marciana. This is where the Venetian Empire coined its money. The famous Campanile, which is a reconstruction of 1912. It fell in 1904, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The cathedral back there, and the Doge's Palace over here. This is really the cradle of thinking about cleaning and conservation. This is where all the major theories about conservation come out of, is that piazza. It's kind of unbelievable. And it's also the place in which John Ruskin, who is somebody that I'm kind of fascinated with, is one of the fathers of modern conservation. He is where he began to really think through his theories of conservation and began to theorize the dust deposited on buildings as foundational to their historic value and character. And he was somebody that was totally opposed to cleaning buildings, as I'm sure all of you know, as something that really effaced the historical significance of the building. And like many of his Romantic contemporaries, he treasured the soiling of buildings as an index of the temporality of architecture. And he called the soiling, he called it a time stain, which to me is very interesting as a kind of concept. He wrote about the cathedral over here. Things like, quote, "Its walls are of alabaster, but worn and shattered and darkly stained with age, almost a ruin. And the time stains on its translucent masses darkened into fields of rich golden brown, like the color of seaweed when the sun strikes on through deep sea." This was in the stones of Venice. Now, he spent long periods of his life in Venice, in this particular spot, thinking about conservation. And Venetian conservators became really influenced by him, and working under his shadow in the 19th century, they began to really treasure the darkness of buildings. And it turns out, Ruskin was coming from London, which was one of the most polluted places in the world, one of the industrial capitals of the world in the 19th century. Most of the buildings around were black because of soot. Venice was not an industrial capital. Venice didn't really have a lot of soot. So Venetian conservators began to, and it's very interesting because they began to identify having polluted buildings and surfaces with being modern. And so there is a big debate now, this is a reverse shot now. This building is being cleaned, that building is being cleaned. These two buildings have been cleaned by two different teams. That building is totally white. That building, to most people, looks dirty. But that building has just been cleaned. And the whole argument is that that dark stain over there is actually the product of Venetian conservators painting it black. But it's a kind of, you know, it's not all settled because the chemistry doesn't quite, is not as telling as one would like. What is true is that when the Campanile fell, it took out most of these three bays and part of that one. So when they rebuilt this, they painted these buildings. We know that they painted those black. But the question is whether they were painting through the 1870s the rest of the Procuratia Nuove, which is that building over there, black. The argument that Doglioni, which is the head conservator in charge of that project, is that they were painting it black precisely for these reasons. And so you have here these two approaches to conservation, and there you have a kind of closer look, and really two approaches about thinking about pollution in relationship to modernity. You know, our kind of understanding of ourselves and our experience of modernity. If you think of architecture as trying to express our experience of modernity, or even painting, conservators are somehow trying to do the same thing here through their particular means. Now, of course, what is very interesting is that in San Marco, all of this really changed about the 1890s when a conservator called Camilo Boito, he lived until 1914, he was the kind of major conservator of Italy in the late 19th century. And he made a big stink. Around the 1870s, there was a project to replace, this is not the facade of the Italy becomes a country, and one of the first projects they decided to do is they want to redo the facade of St. Mark's Cathedral. And of course, British intellectuals are very involved in this. There's the founding of William Morris's Society for the Preservation of Ancient Buildings gets really involved in this. They send letters to the Italian government and so on. Don't touch it. Don't do it. You know, you cannot. And they win. Actually, the Italian government backs out, and they don't do the transformation of the facade. But as a result of all this, the Italians are beginning to think, you know, what is going on? You know, they want to kind of rethink the conservation. So Boito comes along and says, you know, all this fetishizing of the darkness of the buildings as intrinsic to the building is really wrong. The buildings, the soot on buildings is external to the buildings themselves. And so he goes up and does this kind of cleaning job where he scientifically removes the pollution by spitting on a handkerchief and then cleaning that wall over there and saying, you see, it's soot, you know, it's not real patina, you know, it's not the aging of the stone. So he changes things, and he changes the way that people look at pollution, and he starts the kind of campaigns to clean buildings in Italy. This is being cleaned right now. The whole facade is being completely cleaned. All of the facades in St. Mark's Cathedral. But this building over here really represents the triumph of Boito's thinking, because in it, right there, is what's called the Museo dell'Opera. The Museo dell'Opera was a concept that Boito came up with, which was when you restore any building, you should save whatever you take out of that building in the building itself in a museum about the building. And so this place has all of the capitals that have been removed over time in the various restorations of the building, identified neatly inside the building itself. And then you get this little card, and you can go around seeing where each of the capitals was taken out of. Now, for me, what's interesting is that all the dust, all the pollution that has been removed from this building and others is being thrown away, when pollution is really at the heart of all these debates in Venice and in the conservation world. So this is what I propose to do, which is to take one of the walls, which is the last, this was a picture that we took yesterday, the last wall that has not been cleaned inside the Doge's palace, and to clean it but save all the pollution in it. And the proposal was to put it inside that museum. But of course, they're not really interested in having the pollution of the building inside the building museum. So it turns out that the only way that we could try to inscribe the pollution into the curatorial practices was to actually use a biennial format. So this project will be part of the biennial, and we will basically paint the building, paint that wall in latex, and then we will transfer that latex onto the corderia. The corderia is the arsenale, and it's an important place because all the things that were taken off the Piazza San Marco to be restored were taken over to the corderia to be worked on, like these horses. These horses are 2,000 and plus years old. Nobody knows the exact date. They're ancient Roman. They were taken to Byzantium. They brought back. You know, they have a very rich history. But what is interesting is that they sit here and they tell a very important story about conservation and the environment. And conservators are the first ones to begin to really realize that we live in a polluted atmosphere, and to begin to theorize the change of the environment, and to begin to think of architecture as a kind of unstable object. And these horses, you know, they were removed at various points, but they're fake, quote unquote. These are the real horses inside the building. So again, this kind of process of moving things inside the building. Because at a certain point, well, when you go outside, you see there's various dates inscribed. 1919, 1945, the horses were removed during each of the world wars. But 1982, the horses were actually replaced altogether. The reason being that in the 1960s and 70s, there were these studies, and they began to realize that these horses were turning green for the first time. In ancient copper sculpture, horses, not just horses, but sculptures they were painted with a bitumen to give it a kind of, it looked like olive skin, dark olive skin when it was you know, under the sun and so on. And so these horses had not been green for 2,000 years. They've been sitting outside, and all of a sudden, by the 1960s, they start turning green. So there was a big debate, and people started looking back at the history of conservation and realizing that copper sculptures had not been green until the 19th century, and that they really started turning green in the 19th century. And then people started making green patinas. So accepting the environmental pollutants as part of the aesthetics of sculpture. You know, this is a graph you're probably all familiar with environmental pollution. Beijing on a polluted day on the right, and with rain just after rainfall. And that we don't really have a history of pollution. And for better or worse, pollution is one of the most important products in our civilization. I mean, it's a kind of residual product. I'm interested in it because it's kind of an unintentional product. It's a kind of leftover product. It's formless, it's shapeless. You know, it wasn't meant to have a form. But it has really significant effects on us and the way we perceive cities. You know, there's Pittsburgh at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You can't see the light of day. And so this is another project that I did last year, which was a project to clean the pollution off of a building. This is an aluminum factory that Mussolini built in Alto Adige, which is a part of Italy that Italy got after World War I, that was actually part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where they speak German. So Mussolini did this he built this factory in order to Italianize the area, to kind of clean it up a little bit. So cleaning here acquires also a sociological kind of connotation. And it made aluminum, one of the most polluting kind of metals in terms of production. This is some of the Italian workers going to work. This was demolished, and it's now being turned into offices. And in turning it into offices, what they're doing is that they're cleaning it up, of course. This is the first thing that's happening. They're cleaning up the building. And what I proposed to do, and I asked them, was to, again, intervene into the restoration project, to try to destabilize the actual project. And my project was to save one of the walls, one of the dirty walls, and to actually take the pollution on that wall. So you can see the rest of the factory has been cleaned over here, and this is the wall that I was allowed to save as with pollution on it. And I used really what is a very new type of cleaning technique, which is a latex cleaning technique. It's designed in Belgium. And what we did is we painted the wall with the latex, and then you can see the wall is cleaned over here, and then we pulled the dust on these latex sheets. So you would get these really incredible patterns of soiling in the latex. And we did the entire wall. It started like this. The wall's dirty. And then we did sections. We did 175 different sections. That kind of a performance piece also. And then we hung the latex in front of the wall. So there we're kind of hanging the latex in front of the wall. And then there's the latex going up. And that's the latex finished. So you have the wall in front. That is actually the factory clock over there. That's the kind of ghost of the factory clock in front of it. And people kind of thought of it like animal skin, and people had different reactions to it. It was depending on the way the light hit it. And you could see the clean wall behind it and the dirty wall in front of it as a way to kind of save and create an archive of pollution. And this project and the series of installations that try to preserve pollution are called The Ethics of Dust. As the title is also an appropriation of a book written by Ruskin in the Alps. It was actually a lecture given to schoolgirls. He was a bit, sexuality was kind of, he was really into schoolgirls, and I guess never consummated his marriage. And in fact, the whole book is about how linking dust to womanhood, and so dust turns into stone under pressure, and then becomes stone becomes dust again with age. And young girls like dust become women, stone, cold, hard, under social pressure, and then eventually go into dust again. And so the whole point of the book is to tell them, don't turn into stone, stay dust, and so on. So this is a view of the installation where you can see it's really a massive wall, and it's actually it's been purchased by the Museum of Bolzano, and they will reinstall it in the place. So I was very happy that now it's going to be a permanent installation inside the building. So in a way, for me, that was really a success. And all this to say that for me, to wrap it up, I guess for me, creativity is to create events of appropriation and to design moments for appreciating the manner in which architecture and buildings become mutually contingent, and to create opportunities to witness how the upsurge of buildings into architecture and of architecture in and through buildings stamp both of them in time and renders them both historic. And so for me, through preservation, architectural creativity appears as the incomplete, contingent, and temporal way that architecture and buildings differ from one another while constituting each other. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Jorge. Anyone have a question?
Most of you in conservation, I understand that there's a conservation program here. Yeah? 2? 3? Interesting. Great.
Okay, does the kind of museification of your own piece of latex make you feel in any way uneasy, in the sense that it'll then be treated with kid gloves? Men in white suits with white gloves will be dealing with it as that kind of precious object.
I didn't mention Eva Hesse, who's also a really big influence on me, and one of the reasons why I really like latex is because it's impossible to preserve. It has really a date of death written into it. A sell by date, yeah. So there, you can only do so much to it. So I'm not too worried about it. You know, it's really a temporal piece because the material itself is a temporal material. It's not durable. Although the dust will outlive the latex, you know, but it'll be, I think, compromised once the latex starts to decompose. And that's the problem with Eva Hesse's sculpture, is that, you know, it's all gone basically. So, which to me is really quite amazing. But I learned the lesson that you've got to wear a mask when you play with latex, because I guess she died from breathing the stuff in. So, but that's a really good question. Yeah, I thought of that when they proposed to take the piece, and the conversation, you know, what happened was really the conversation turned around. They wanted to take different pieces of this and basically distribute it to different dignitaries in Bolzano, you know, frame it and put it, you know, this is for the whoever and so on. So they, you know, it would be like kind of paintings. And so we had a very tough negotiation where I had to argue this is one wall. You cannot, and it's actually, you know, site specific, and you can't divide it up and sell it and make paintings out of it. So that the conversation went more along those lines.
Could I just ask you a question about this may be a psychological question, so it may not be relevant, but what seems to me to be very interesting about this is that what's taken to be alien to the building or even destructive to it is actually seen to be integral to it. So it's as though the question posed is, what if anything is superfluous to a building? Or is the very thing that destroys it essential to it? Because it's like nothing will, it makes one think of a situation in which one would never get rid of anything.
Right.
If you see what I mean.
Right.
As though there would be kind of universal incorporation.
Yeah. Because the pollution, you think of the pollution as destroying the building somehow. I mean, by removing it, if that were the case, which sometimes it isn't actually, sometimes pollution protects the building. What I find interesting about this is that it removes it from the wall. So it's free from the wall, but in a sense, it's never really free from the wall. It's always kind of, it's only understandable in relationship to the wall. I mean, this piece is kind of meaningless unless you... The other piece, the one for the Ducale, is less site-specific because that particular building is all about taking pieces and moving them around. So, but I find that, I mean, I think that's, you go to the heart of the question there. I mean, conservation cannot touch anything without destroying it. It's a kind of, or transforming it, depending on how you want to look at it. But it's amazing to me that when we talk in conservation, everyone talks as though we are not destroying the thing. You know, we are just kind of preserving, you know, the whole idea of conservation, the leaving it as found. It's, you know, you're always stabilizing, you know, you're doing these really radical interventions and injecting stuff into mortar walls and so on to say, you know, you're really transforming the thing itself. But it's always done under the guise of nothing happened. I mean, here is what Jeff Wall has a great sentence. You know, he says, cleaning is mysterious because if it's done well, it effaces itself. You know, so it's kind of, conservation is kind of like that. Or it aspires to be that, but at the same time, so much is lost about what is creative in the process of cleaning or if you will, destroying, because also a lot of responsibility gets kind of swept under the carpet because it's always thought to be objective. Conservation is the most subjective thing. You should see the conversations that I had with the Ducal Palace, head conservators about should we stop cleaning here or should we stop cleaning here? Should we get the little head of the, you know, and it was all basically a power game, you know, because I wanted to go to here, and they're like, well, no, you're going to go to here. But in the end, you know, it was like, you know, it was totally subjective. But in the end, it's presented as this very, you know, objective thing. So for me, playing up the subjective part is important because it's a way to rediscover a sort of creativity that has subjectivity in it, but is not dependent on intentionality. I mean, it's, you know, I'm working through this. It's not...
body smells would be a very good example of that, wouldn't they? Because one doesn't in any sense intend the smell of one's breath, the smell of one's sweat.
Right.
But it is integral to oneself, and one is not oneself without it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You make it, but
you
you don't intend it.
Yeah, that's yeah, that one is, you know, so how, to translate that into architectural terms, it was, I mean, I guess the smell project, that's a great way of describing it, because it was in a way trying to do that. I always find that intentionality is a kind of residue in all these projects, you know, because I can't not intend to do something, you know.
It's sort of like leads on from the question about smell, actually. I mean, because I think, I mean, first of all, very few people ever write about architecture and smell. I think Burke is actually one of the few who actually does talk about it. And it seems to me, you know, what's interesting about introducing the unexpected characteristic of smell into architecture is because, in a sense, it is itself actually quite complicated and involves a sort of certain, you know, it's not just smell as a sort of gross subjective kind of register, because if one thinks about it, smell always comes with a certain kind of splitting. That is to say, even when we just ordinarily smell, we think, we say like the smell comes from over there, without, as it were, realizing that in order to smell, it must be already in our nose.
Right.
And so it comes always partially kind of like as a defense. I mean, smell is like a defense against smell. If we lose that, then we start to want to vomit. I mean, it's the moment you lose that. Once you realize actually it's inside you,
right,
then you wish to sort of expel it. So well, I find your argument absolutely fascinating. But it seems to me that if one actually carries on the sort of phenomenology of smell, one gets to sort of quite odd results. It's not that one's doing one thing or another. One's introducing actually a new split in the arrangement. And in a sense, you know, I think that has something to do, you know, if you go back to vision, which is how it's normally kind of construed, as if vision were kind of simple, which it's obviously not, you get this sort of characteristic in orthodox preservation or conservation that they conserve something and they're going to clean it and restore it to its what they call original state. But if you go around National Trust properties in Britain, they all look as though they've got this kind of varnish over them, you know, called, you know, it's not a scent, but it's a thing, you know, sort of like the past.
Right, right.
But actually, it's not remotely historical any longer. It's just this varnish that tells you you're looking at a building of the past. And so, I mean, in a completely incoherent way, I mean, I'm trying to say, you know, there are a number of sort of splittings and sort of results. I mean, I think they're there actually, visually at least, in the Matter Clark, such that the question of smell is very difficult. I think the only thing I really disagreed with you in the paper is I don't think it's true that in the 50s men didn't have many kind of good sense. I think there were plenty around.
Oh, really? Well, I defer there to the perfumer who was the one that made that claim, and I
say like this Old Spice. And I
followed it. You know, it's not my area of expertise, but apparently you were around. You remember?
No, but I mean, we can be assured that Philip Johnson would have known what there was to know about it.
But in terms of this splitting that you're mentioning, which is really interesting, you know, one of the things that I really struggled with the smell thing was that it's totally artificial, and there was no way to harvest smells. You know, we couldn't do it. Nobody knew how to harvest smells. So people know how to recreate smells. In fact, the only thing you can do is to reconstruct smells. But nobody had a way to actually, you know, go into the house and, you know, take that piece of plaster and make it and then multiply it somehow. So there was that splitting in terms of authenticity. And, you know, and so you could only get at authenticity through a total artificiality, which to me was kind of interesting. Which I don't know if that. Really
So you can you're saying you can recreate them,
right?
But you can't, as it were, produce them. But isn't that partly because actually, if they were produced, what smells are forms of decomposition? I mean,
I suppose.
you know, so
right.
It's not surprising in a sense that smell has a certain rhetorical primacy in what you're saying, because it's about, in a sense, the passage of time rather than the instance of history.
Thank you for. I'm going to remember that. I should be taking notes.
But I was going to say that the artificiality for me was more the fixing of time than the artificiality itself. In terms of that, the artificial part of it was the fact that it was fixed at a moment. However artificial that moment might be,
right.
But that it was the fixing of something in one
in
moment.
The
But both with the smell and the dirt, I think, because both are about movement.
Right.
So but it made it more interesting, or another area of interest.
It's like everyone thinks they know from Proust what Proust was talking about with Madeleine, but actually no one ever does because they haven't gone and reread it.
Right. It's a commitment.
It's like an analog.
Wow. So there's somebody there that's taking you around and telling you what it smells like. Right. I mean, I guess for me, the question with all these things is, you know, in the service of who are you doing all this stuff, you know, like, and to what end? So, you know, if you're doing it as a kind of, it sounds like really a freaky, kind of strange place, but, you know, if it's just to be the most authentic, so you get the most visitors, you know, because all these house museums are dead. I mean, they are really dead. Nobody goes to house museums, so they're trying to reinvent themselves. In fact, the glass house, the whole point of it is to try to reinvent the house museum by, now it's modern. Now everybody, you know, is interested in modernism, so everyone will go to the house it's a house museum. So they face the same problems. So, you know, the question is, you know, if it's just in the service of the kind of tourist industry, or the kind of, you know, local nostalgic type of industry, and then I think it's problematic. I mean, because I think part of what we have a responsibility to do is, you know, so much of conservation is official, run by these state bureaucracies and so on and so forth, and basically inheriting, they were created with the rise of the nation state. So, you know, I think to be trained to be in the service of that is a bit of a problem. And so that how do we, at this, you know, on the one hand, recuperate and grasp what is creative and important about conservation without having to become subservient to the institutional mechanisms that are in place dominating conservation, I think is the question, you know. So, you know, but it can be done, except that it's very hard because, you know, you'll get money instantly to do a conservation project if you work with a you know, bureaucracy. But if you don't, it's very, very hard. It takes, I mean, what I found is that it takes a kind of big international event for anybody to give, you know, like, they give a contract for billions of dollars to clean the whole facade on very scant kind of evidence, you know. In fact, the Procuratia is being cleaned with Rolex money. And the only reason is because Rolex is putting their big sign on it. You know, that is Rolex money right there. It's Swatch now, but basically it's the Rolex. So they pay for the scaffolding, and in fact, it's going to be there until 2012, when they could be done in 6 months. But they need to amortize the advertising. So that happens like that, no problem. They get a signature, you know. But to actually, when they see you coming, because they see me coming, you know, and it takes a big international, like a biennial, for them to say, okay, we'll let you clean the wall, but you cannot clean it to here. You got to clean it to here, you know. So I think that, in a way, it's hard, but I think it's possible, and I think that then conservation can begin to contribute a lot to other disciplines. I think, you know. It can also learn a lot from other disciplines. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much. I appreciate your coming and your attention. Thanks.